The product rule and quotient rule of square roots will be used to help you to simplify square roots. The product rule states that if you have two numbers being multiplied by each other within a square root, then you can actually break that up into two separate square roots with each of the factors, square root of each of the factors. The same is true for the quotient, where if you have a fraction, two things being divided by each other within a square root, then you can break that up into the square root of the numerator and the square root of the denominator. So a square root is considered simplified if its radicand, and the radicand is the thing inside the square root, has no perfect square factors, if its radicand is not a fraction, and if you have a fraction, there is no radical in a denominator. It helps when you're looking for the perfect square factors to have a list of them or to have them memorized. If I want to simplify the square root of 8, the first thing I want to do is think of any perfect square factors that 8 is divisible by. So if you look at the list that I previously showed you, 8 is divisible by 4. So what I'm going to do is rewrite the square root of 8 as the square root of 4 times 2. The reason I did this is the product rule tells me if I have two numbers being multiplied by each other within the radicand, I can actually break this up into two separate square roots. So the reason for doing this is because 4 is a perfect square, I know what the square root of it is. The square root of 4 is 2, so I can simplify this as 2 times the square root of 2. I can do the same thing with the square root of 48. 48 has a perfect square factor of 16. So it is 16 times 3. So I can rewrite that as the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. And I did that because I know the square root of 16 is 4. And I'm just going to leave the square root of 3 as it is because it does not simplify any further. I can do the same thing with the square root of 18. The square root of 18. 18 has a perfect square factor of 9. So it's 9 times 2. So that's the square root of 9 times the square root of 2, or 3 times the square root of 2. Now, when you have two fractions, two radicals being divided by each other like this, you can do this in two ways. First, you can, find the square root of 18 as 3 times the square root of 2 like we did here, and then you could cross out the square root of 2's if you want. But you can also use the quotient rule to say this is the same thing as 18 divided by 2, or the square root of 18 divided by 2. Oops, excuse me. And we know 18 divided by 2 is 9, and we know the square root of 9 is 3. Now you can do the same thing but in the opposite direction, where here I don't know what 16 divided by 49 is. It's not going to give me a nice pretty number like 9 like this one did. But what I can do is do the square root of 16 over the square root of 49, because I know the square root of 16 is 4 and I know the square root of 49 is 7. For a fraction to be considered simplified, it cannot have a square root in its denominator. So we're going to do what is known as rationalizing the denominator. The way you do this is whatever the denominator is, if it's a radical, then you multiply the numerator and denominator by that value. So the radical in the denominator here is the square root of 7, so I'm going to multiply the numerator and denominator by 7. Now, when you multiply a square root by itself, you just get what is inside the radicand. So I'm just going to get 7 there. And then 5 times the square root of 7, I'm just going to leave as 5 times the square root of 7. I can do the same thing here. The radical in the denominator is square root of 3. I don't want a radical in the denominator, so I'm going to multiply the numerator and the denominator by the square root of 3. Square root of 3 times square root of 3 is just 3. And 1 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 3. And for the last one, we're going to multiply the numerator and denominator by the square root of 2. So the denominator, when I do square root of 2 times square root of 2, I'm just going to get 2. And the numerator will be 2 times the square root of 2. But I'm not done because I need to simplify this, and I just get the square root of 2.